Previously, we've seen how a surprise new discovery made by Charles Micklewright at the Lilford estate in England now looks set to rewrite American history, and how Elizabethan England was a literal cauldron of religious unrest and persecution by the state for simply failing to attend church each week. The birth of just one man, Robert Browne, and the formation of his followers as the Brownist movement set about a process of change which would eventually lead to the formation of a new country, the United States of America. When telling the life story of Robert Browne, it's clear that it's almost impossible to tell the whole story about the man and the revolution he inspired, without also telling the story of his beloved Lilford estate, because the two are inextricably linked.
And I think this is the closest one can get to getting one's hands on Robert Browne and sense his presence.
Not only was the Lilford estate his constant retreat, refuge and spiritual home, it was also the place where Robert Browne did much of his deepest thinking, and where some of his most inspired ministries would take place. He knew that he couldn't fulfill his dream of building what he envisioned as being the New Jerusalem without help. So, Robert Browne intensely inspired others to continue the process of change he had set into motion.
They didn't have a church, so they had meetings in Robert Browne's house. So he actually took the people into his home to preach to them. He inspired people to take risks with their lives and look for freedom and the new world. He's responsible for the 6th President of the United States, the Quincy's. They were neighbours of Robert Browne here at the Lilford estate. He inspired great men in the States.
After his idyllic school days spent in the picturesque village of Oundle near Lilford, Robert Browne then becomes a student at Corpus Christi in Cambridge. It was while studying at Corpus Christi that Robert Browne first began developing his ideas about religion, which were considered to be extremely radical at the time. The lectures and ideas of Puritan theologian Professor Thomas Cartwright, with his neo-Calvinist beliefs, had a particular impact on the young Robert Browne, and his classmate and friend, Robert Harrison of Norwich. Ironically, it was William Cecil, who was first Baron Burghley at the time, who was Chancellor at the elite Cambridge University, and would also prove to be Robert Browne's greatest lifelong protector. Sir William Cecil of the spectacular Burghley estate in Lincolnshire was the second most powerful person in England, next to Queen Elizabeth I, with the Archbishop of Canterbury ranking just below him, and was the chief advisor to the Queen for most of her reign. He was twice Secretary of State, and he was also the Lord High Treasurer. Upon leaving Corpus Christi, the now much more radical Robert Browne became a teacher at the school he had once been a pupil at, the prestigious Oundle School close to Lilford. After leaving Oundle, Robert Browne went back to Cambridge, where his preaching license awaited him.
I have my divine right to preach by the power of God, and no realm or establishment is above that power. God is from within, God is from above, and not from some trinket given to me by the establishment.
Perhaps this one act was the spark needed to light the kindle of religious rebellion, which would eventually become an unstoppable fire of change for generations to come. After publicly performing this audacious act, he was visited by the Archbishop's emissary, Richard Bancroft, who demanded he stop preaching. Robert Browne defied him and continued preaching until he was struck down with the dreaded plague. Against all the odds, and perhaps even miraculously, Robert Browne could not even be stopped by the worst of all diseases of the time, and he eventually recovered while at his father's home of Tolthorpe. Tolthorpe Hall in Rutland, England was built in 1088 and was the home to Robert Browne's father from 1503 onwards. His father sent the still recovering Robert Browne to complete his convalescence at his beloved spiritual home, the Lilford estate. Finding inspiration from his deepest beliefs in God, Robert Browne made the extraordinary decision to split from the Anglican Church.
In 1581, at Lilford Hall, I came to the conclusion that the common man should pray directly to God, and no monarchy nor bishops had the right to intervene.
Robert Browne became the first person to separate the Church from the state. Even though this was an act of heresy in England at the time, it was also to be a founding principle which the United States was built upon. Robert Browne and his Brownist followers saw clearly that the stained and fettered Church of England was not God's way, and therefore it was not their way. Robert Browne believed that they had the extraordinary honour of restoring the rights of the people of God. However, by now Robert Browne had made a great many enemies, including Richard Bancroft, who was later to become the Archbishop of Canterbury and the head of the new Church of England. The people of the increasingly powerful Brownist movement love him even more. The state grew to despise him. Consequently, they were now left with no option, and they had to be seen to take decisive action. So, Robert Browne was arrested and thrown into jail.
He'd been in jail 32 times during his life, and that didn't just affect him, that also affected his wife.
His wife could have been thrown in with him.
For in this home that I know so well, shall I still favour what I know to be righteous and godly? For this belief is stronger than any iron or stone of man's making.
Fortunately for Browne, his powerful family and friends would come to his rescue, with Sir William Cecil brokering his release.
My kinsman Lord Burleigh safeguarded me many times during my life.
Once they are set free, both Browne and Harrison are now left with no option but to escape to Middelburg in the Netherlands. This was such an arduous journey at the time that it would take them no less than 2 attempts before they succeeded, together with 60 members of their most loyal congregation. While in Middelburg, Robert Browne begins to publish books and leaflets, with 2 becoming his most famous, or perhaps infamous.
He actually started writing and producing pamphlets, as they were called.
We actually saw an original 1500s copy of a pamphlet produced by Robert Browne.
And this was the particular leaflet and book that the state were not happy about. And it was really quite spiritual to be able to handle a book of which there's only 3 left in the whole world, who you knew people had been hanged for distributing.
Rather than remain preaching to a fixed congregation in Middelburg, Robert Browne became more determined than ever to spread his word far and wide. So he left the Netherlands and went to Scotland, where he was met with equally fierce opposition from James VI. Every time Robert Browne is arrested, his cousin and lifelong protector, William Cecil, the first Baron Burleigh, comes to his rescue. This time, Browne decides to flee as a fugitive to England.
He came back to England in an environment where his followers were being hung up against trees, and one can only imagine what that would have been to a man like that. He came back to here in Lilford, where he was in hiding.
My literature caused the hanging of my innocent followers.
By this time, Robert Browne is married to Alice Allen, who was probably a member of his congregation in Middelburg. However, the couple have 1 child and another on the way, So Browne decides to face the charges of him publishing books and leaflets while he was in Middelburg.
He was a loving husband, a family man. His wife was a beauty. They had 9 children, very happy together. She endured a huge amount with Robert Browne. They went to Holland together, they came back to the Lilford estate together.
As a man of the deepest convictions, Robert Browne simply cannot stay silent for long, and he eventually begins to publish more books and leaflets which are as always considered to be heresy by the establishment. This time, the punishment is very different. Robert Browne is not simply thrown into jail. Instead, he is called before the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest religious office in the land, to answer directly for his actions. This is now extremely serious for both Robert Browne and his family. As always, William Cecil eventually brokers a deal, but this time it takes more than a fine and promises to secure his freedom. This time, Robert Browne is forced to officially sign a statement of submission in order to save the lives of his family.
I do believe that Robert Browne recanted on paper, but in his heart, I don't believe he ever recanted. I mean, let's face it, he did it for his wife, Alice. They had 9 children. She had been to hell and back with him. Don't forget, in those days, when you went to prison, your wife went with you.
The metaphorically battered and bruised Robert Browne was then given the position of headmaster at Stamford School, where it was thought that he might settle into a quiet, less troublesome life. Until now, for most historians, this is where the story of Robert Browne ends. However, this is definitely not the case. If anything, the best is yet to come. New research has revealed that this was simply the birth of the rebel who would inspire the Brownist emigration to found the first civilian settlement in the New World, and in doing so, plant the seeds for the eventual formation of the United States of America. Coming next, we see how the Brownist movement, inspired by Robert Browne, takes on a life and momentum of its own in becoming an unstoppable force for change. The movement he inspired is now set to change the world forever, despite Robert Browne's personal fate being eventually sealed.